Bula whānau, o kia ora. It's good to be here again today. I have the opportunity to talk about the Pacific and some of the security issues which are evolving in this particular sort of part of the world. And as we've seen recently, the huge focus from the US and China in terms of its influence in this particular area. In the recent Pacific Islands Forum, we had Kamala Harris, who was able to Zoom in and speak virtually within the conference. And at the same time, we had an exclusion of China. And this is really interesting because over a period of time, the Americans have been absent from the Pacific. And now they're seeing the increasing influence of the Chinese. The Chinese have applied a development strategy for a number of years that provided capital, infrastructure, and even now they're offering scholarships and training right across the countries of the Pacific. Chinese delegations and officials have recently conducted an 8-nation tour and have gone into some fairly strong agreements with the Solomon Islands and Kiribati. And these agreements are concerning to a certain extent. And we'll talk about that in the podcast. I'll be interviewing Nemani Delaibatiki, a foreign correspondent and managing editor of the Fiji Sun, and someone that's well-traveled and knows the Pacific. But importantly, he's from the Pacific, and we hope to present a Pacifica worldview, a perspective that comes from Pacific. And so today I'm quite excited because we're going to be talking about some of the challenges that need to be considered and looked at the coming years when we think about the Pacific security. And do we have the Chinese development strategy versus the American security strategy? It becomes important to Australia and New Zealand in the sense that we've been allies and part of the Pacific nations for a period of time. And recently we were invited to become part of the sub-regions within the Pacific, with New Zealand becoming part of the Polynesian group, Australia becoming part of the Melanesian group, and then, of course, that leaves the Micronesian group. And I believe a major country or nation is yet to be sort of appointed to that particular area. And so at this stage, I want to sort of just prep this podcast a little bit. I've got vested interests. I was fortunate to go to school in Fiji as a young man, and I went to Goldfields Primary in Vatukola, and it was a beautiful time for me. I love Fiji. I love the people. I love the culture. And from my perspective, Fiji is a very, very big part of who I am as a person. And I've got Fijian in my family, and I'm so blessed to call this wonderful country part of who I am, but also to be part of the Pacific. So at this stage, we're going to be talking about this challenge between the US and China and the influence in the Pacific, and also listening to the perspective of someone that is Pacifica. So with that, kia ora whānau, and panaka whakalevu. Thank you very much for listening in the first place in advance, and I'd like to welcome Mr. Nemani Delaibatiki. Kia ora. Kia ora, Nemani. Thank you for being here today. In the first place, I just want to mihi to you and just say that it's a real privilege to have you participate in one of these podcasts. And I think the key thing for me is that, you know, we don't quite often come across someone like yourself. And, you know, for our listening audience and those who are going to be looking at this podcast, I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of your background, if that's okay, so that people understand who we're talking to. So thank you. So Nemani is a journalist by profession. He was educated at Queen Victoria School in Fiji, a premier boarding school originally staffed by British expats before teaching positions became localised. It has actually educated many Fijian leaders. He joined the Fiji Times in 1972 as a cadet reporter when most of the editorial staff were British expats, worked in sports, news, business desks, and reported on the 1972 election, the first after independence in 1970, and subsequent general elections, 2 elections in 1977 1982, 1987, after which Sitiviti Ramuka overthrew the new government. Was editor of the original Fiji Sun newspaper in 1987. The paper was closed by the military because he refused censorship. He joined the Waikato Times at the old site in Te Rapa, Hamilton, Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1988 as a sub-editor. In 1991, he took up a contract to start the Fiji Daily Post newspaper in Suva. Before that, it was operating as a weekly and then returned to New Zealand in 1996 and rejoined the Waikato Times. In 2013, he was back in Fiji for a 6-month contract to conduct editorial training for the new Fiji Sun newspaper under different owners. In addition, he wrote analysis, opinion, editorial columns for the paper, and he's still doing it today, but remotely using technology. He has attended fellowships overseas, including the Commonwealth Press Union Fellowship, spent time in Britain looking at how the media there operated, was president of the Fiji Media Association, and got involved in the setting up of training programs for media industry workers. He spent time in southern Lebanon with the United Nations peacekeeping force during one of the most turbulent periods, the conflict between the PLO and Israel. Fijian soldiers were part of that force, and is the only Fijian journalist to be prosecuted for breaching the Official Secrets Act when he exposed the bad blood between the army and its line ministry. He was acquitted and is an archaic British law, because it is an archaic British law that is still in the statutory books today. Wow. Nemani, I'm very honoured to have you here today, and as a foreign correspondent and someone that's travelled the world extensively, which I know is part of your profile as well, I think it's just we're very fortunate to have your calibre here. So kia ora to you, bula bula, good to see you.
Bula, kia ora.
Yeah, manakalevu. So with that, I, as I said in our catch-up before, is that there's a lot of stuff happening in the Pacific Islands, and there seems to be from a security perspective, from a perspective of development and also climate change, there appears to be quite a bit of jostling between a number of superpowers, the United States, China, and of course, we know for a long time that Australia and New Zealand have been a very big part of the Pacific Islands in terms of support, their development, and also trying to help with climate change to a certain extent. And so I guess the first thing I want to talk to you about and ask for your korero, your feedback, is that what do you make of this, this emphasis by the US and China to jostle for a position of influence upon the Pacific? Why are they doing it? And why is it important that the US succeeds and China succeeds, or either or neither succeed? So go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, I think there certainly has been a resurgence of building their interest in the Pacific. And this is due to a number of reasons.
Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, there's certainly been a resurgence in interest in the Pacific between the United States and China. And this is due to a number of reasons. I think the main one is what's building up, the tension that is building up between China and Taiwan. And I think that has sort of spread to the rest of the region. And also because of, the current, economic climate, around the world. There's been an increase in activity in the Pacific. The recent Pacific Island forums meeting of regional leaders in Suva, which just ended, clearly demonstrated that they are back I mean, especially the US, it's now back in the Pacific. There was one time, if you can remember, after the Cold War, the US had virtually packed up and left the region. As far as, from Fiji, from Fiji's, where Fiji stands, they withdrew things like, the Peace Corps, the American Peace Corps volunteer service that used to operate at the time. Yeah, that got phased out. And there were a number of other things that got phased out. And then I think the US left it to Australia to look after things in the region. But China, over the years, has always been there, working quietly among the Pacific Islands, trying to spread its influence. And I think I think it was in 2019, was it, that the Solomons and Kiribati broke their relations with Taiwan, right? And then accepted China as their new diplomatic allies. Now that made the US, sit up and say, hey, there's something serious happening here. And then, of course, this year, Solomons and China signed an agreement for security and development. While it sounded general, the implications are quite serious from the US perspective. And of course, Australia, New Zealand, and other regional partners, in the Pacific. So that's why the Americans are back in force now. It got to the stage where you had to have they had to have the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, to address the Pacific Island Forum leaders, virtually, to state the U.S. position in the Pacific, and to reassure them that, look, they are back. And they admitted, she admitted that, they had somehow did not give the attention the Pacific needed, when it needed it. And so all these things came out in her address. And so now, they're tripling, the funding in, aid to the region. And they are coming up with all kinds of initiatives to try and counter the growing influence of China in the region.
Now, Nemani, this is really interesting because it seems to be sort of like a proxy zone to a certain extent between both the US and China in terms of their policies to each other, and they're vying for sort of influence. And I guess the question I've got is that obviously at the Pacific Islands Forum is that the US were represented, and obviously China were not invited, and that certainly made a statement, I guess, to the world. And Australia and New Zealand are natural partners with the US. We know that from a security perspective, but we also know too that they've got fairly strong trade agreements and relationships with China, particularly New Zealand at this stage. And I guess my question goes down to the people on the ground. What is their perception? I mean, you've got China, which presents a development strategy, and you've got the US largely, which has presented a security/development strategy. And it's almost as though the development strategy is coming after the security strategy. So you've got China, which is all about development, investment, supporting infrastructure. And as you were saying, they've had a soft approach into the Pacific Islands for a long time. Well, not sure if you can call it soft, but they've been there. So the Pacific Islander on the ground, when we think about climate change, when we think about development, economic development, and are they thinking to themselves, well, we need security more than we do development or economic support or support with infrastructure? I mean, how do they think? What would be the Pacific Island perspective, thinking about these two superpowers, which are sort of playing in the backyard and trying to influence one to go with the other?
Yeah, well, historically, Australia, New Zealand, and the US have had that relationship with Fiji, going back to the First World War and the Second World War, where they had troops stationed in the Pacific, especially in Fiji, and a lot of Fijians remember that, and so they've got an affinity to the Kiwis and the Aussies and the Americans because of those old ties. In Subo, we had the Royal New Zealand Air Force Base in Lodala Bay. We still got structures there that remind people that they were once there. And of course, now Australia and New Zealand have become the main development partners in the region, not only for Fiji, but for other island nations in the Pacific. So there is that, what shall I say, unbreakable ties between all these, the development partners and the small island states in the region. And I think the same goes for for the other islands, the Solomons, Papua New Guinea and all the other islands. And so from the on the ground, that's the Fijian perspective, the ties, they've been there all the time. Now, today, because the way the world is going, and a lot of things revolve around money, it sort of changes the dynamics. The people are aware that China is present, right? And let me tell you that China is working very hard, in the development aspect. It's working very hard, and it's helping wherever it can. And so I've personally witnessed it in Fiji, and they're there. They've got the money. They're just looking to where to use it, for development. And so, look, in the islands, that's what we need. We need capital to be able to develop our ourselves. Even a thing like a little kindergarten, in a rural community, that is a major thing for the people who live in that community. And this is what China does. So it helps out, in the communities. And so people look at it from that perspective. Now, the security aspect, it's not, doesn't rank as high as the development. I'm talking about the grassroots Fijian. It's only when you come into that level, when you talk about the intellectual community, where these things are discussed, then people become aware that behind this development push, is that security concern. And so, there was one time, I remember in the building up to the 2018 election in Fiji, there was a rumor going around that one of the islands, and I think Kandavu, has been sold to the Chinese. Now I don't know how that started, but it happened because they said, oh, Fiji could not afford to pay its debt to China, and so China came in and took Kandavu, and so, but that was not true. But it got started. But that's what I'm saying. It's that kind of thinking. Somebody started it, and it spread like wildfire. Now, there's one thing we know about the Chinese. They are hardworking people. They are hardworking people. And in Fiji, they're involved in agriculture and in other kinds of business, especially in the food industry. And so they are fair, they're working on the ground. Their people are very industrious people. They work hard and they show their quality by what they produce, and they live among the people as well. I mean, these are the ordinary Chinese nationals, and some have even taken up residence in Fiji. They've become citizens of the country. But going back to your original question about security and development, I think right now for the people, I think development ranks number one, and then security number two. And I'm talking about regional security. On the security aspect, Fiji is pretty confident that its military, its defense force can look after Fiji, because of its experience in peacekeeping and all that, that we can look after ourselves. But the people in the know, they know that, look, if we get invaded by a big power, there's no way we'll be able to defend ourselves, because we just don't have the firepower or the means to be able to defend the island. So it's always that perception out there about the importance of security, and it will be talked about. But right now, I think the way things are, I think the economic aspects are more important to the people than the security.
Thank you for that. I recall, and as you know, I went to school in Fiji when I was a boy back in the 70s, and I went to, I was in Vatakola, and I went to Goldfields Primary. It was an expat school, and at the time, the Goldfield mines were owned by a combination of Australian and some South African. And I know recently, in the last decade or so, that ownership has been transferred to Chinese owners, and which is interesting. And but way back in the day, I would go to school, and there'd be Australians there. There'd be one or two New Zealanders, but there'd be one or two British, and that was school for us. It was a combination of Fijian, Indian, Australian, a few British, and one or two New Zealanders, and those are happy days. These were prior to the first coup, and I think the thing that stood out for me is that it was quite a there was quite a big influence of Australian products, Australian partnerships economically, and there were literally maybe no Chinese there at all. In fact, the only Chinese I can recall was a Chinese restaurant in Latoka that we would go to about once every 2 weeks, and we'd get our chop suey and our chow mein, and we loved it. And but then to go back to Fiji years later, and to see the population difference is quite amazing in Suva or in Nandi, and more Chinese there. So I think this concept of development and economically, and as you're saying, rightly so, the Chinese are very hard workers, and they do make an impact economically on the ground. And businesses form around them, and employment is created, and so there's no doubt that that type of investment or support into Pacific communities has a positive impact. But you're also correct in saying too that historically, the Pacific Islands with the US and with Australia and New Zealand has worked together. And if we look at the Second World War in terms of the Japanese invasions, and going right back to the First World War, and even the German influence in places such as Samoa and Tonga as an example, and the British influence in Fiji, and even today we see Fijian soldiers, which are part of the Royal Guard up in the UK, and which is exciting to see them in their Zulus, and to know that they're part of the British Defence Forces. So there's no doubt there's that strong historical tie. But I think what you're saying is really interesting about what's happening today with economics, what's happening today with climate change. Are people addressing these things? And with the Pacifica people that I speak to, there does tend to be more of a focus on what's happening economically to them and what's happening with climate change. And so it's just interesting to see that all of a sudden we've got this rushing of these superpowers which are trying to be important and have influence. And so my question then sort of comes back to the caretakers evidently that were working with the Pacific, which is Australia and New Zealand. And I want to talk about their performance in terms of support and security within the Pacific Islands over the last 2, 3, 4 decades. And so from your perception, Nemani, and your travels through the Pacific and your dealings, is how has Australia and New Zealand performed in terms of Pacific partners? We know that recently they've joined the subgroup regions. As you were saying, I think Australia is part of the Melanesian subgroup region. New Zealand's part of the Polynesian subgroup region, and we're yet to wait for someone to be appointed to the Micronesian subgroup region. And these are regions, for the listeners, which are part of the Pacific Islands Forum. And traditionally, both Australia and New Zealand have not actually been there, but them joining these sub-region groups allows them to have some voting capability and so on. But what is Australia and New Zealand's scorecard, Nemani, in terms of how have they done for the last 3 or 4 decades?
Well, after the recent Pacific Island Forum's leaders meeting in Suva, they've now raised their involvement in the Pacific. They are now actually part of the Pacific now that they've joined the sub-regions of Melanesia and Polynesia. And so they're now part of the region now. They're not just development partners standing out there and then trying to help. They're now with us in the Pacific, and they are part of us. And I think that was the message that Jacinda Ardern and Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, that was the message that they that came out from them when they spoke after the meeting, that they are now part and parcel of the Pacific. Now, previously, we sort of took that for granted. I don't know, from where we are, that's the way it was. But now, they are now in the group now. They are now part of the Pacific. So anything that happens in the Pacific, they would be affected as well. You know what I mean? So, because they're sitting in these meetings, they're at the coalface. When problems come to these meetings, they will have the opportunity to deal with them firsthand. They don't have to wait till the end of the diplomatic, the end of the diplomatic chain, and then try and address the problem. No, a major shift in dynamics within regional, the geopolitics in the region. And I think that's good from the US perspective. The US has used Australia, mainly Australia, as its proxy in the Pacific. But that hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. Now the result is that China has been able to kick out Taiwan as a diplomatic ally to Kiribati and to the Solomons. And moreover, they've now established or they've signed an agreement with the Solomons for development and security. Now, who knows what happens after that? The Kiribati, is quite interesting. They may be small, in terms of land mass, but they've got this vast area of ocean, right? And they've got some very, what shall I say, lucrative part of that ocean, where it's like a protected marine life area. And what if China wields its power and says, look, nobody else is allowed to go into that area, only China. And so, these are the implications. The Americans have reacted by opening a new embassy in Kiribati, and also they're going to open a new embassy in Tonga. Now, previously, Tongans and people from Kiribati come to Suva to apply for a visa to enter the US. Now, if you've been to Kiribati and you've been to Tonga, well, Tonga, maybe it's okay to have an embassy there, but Kiribati is pretty small. If you look at maybe from an economic sense, it doesn't make sense, but the US reacted, and it reacted by setting up an embassy there to try and appease, the Kiribati people. Now, the other thing is, as you've known, Kiribati is now withdrawn from the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, that was a major issue at the recent Pacific Island Forum meeting. And people are asking why, and they're using the reason that, they were not part of the earlier meeting in Suva, which drew up the Suva agreement, and they were not part of it. And so that's why, as a matter of principle, they had to withdraw. But did they have to take the drastic action? That is the question. Why did they have to withdraw? And people are making the assumption that does China, or they're asking the question, does China have an influence in what Kiribati is doing? Now, but then you look at the Solomons. The Solomons attended the meeting and participated as a normal member of the Pacific Islands Forum. And so these are matters to think about for not only the Pacific Island Forum members, but also for Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So moving forward, I think it's going to affect the way we do things now. We do business. There'll be more, like I said, Australia and New Zealand. There'll be a more hands-on approach to dealing with specific issues. In the build-up to the Australian elections, Albanese said that Australia hadn't done enough in the Pacific. it cut, it sort of the aid was reduced, and there was not enough support on the ground, and it blamed his predecessor, Scott Morrison, for what has happened, for China growing its influence, because Australia hasn't done enough. So I think all this have contributed to the way things are going to happen now, and you'll see more activity from the US and Australia and New Zealand. They've always been there, but I think they will lift it to another level.
This bodes well, I guess, because this competition, this jostling of influence, brings investment, brings support, brings development focus to the Pacific, and so there's some pretty good, outcomes, I guess, to a certain extent about what's going on, and some of it may be seen, some of the people I've spoken to have indicated to a certain extent that while some of it has appeared to be tokenistic in the past, it's becoming sort of more tangible in terms of what could potentially happen now. As in the weekend, we watched the All Blacks lose to Ireland in a game of rugby. We watched the Wallabies also lose to England in a game of rugby. But it was interesting to note that if you looked at the makeup of the All Black team and the Wallabies team, the teams have got strong influence in terms of our Pacific Island brothers, and which is, when we think about the Māori saying, ko tātou, tātou, we are one, it's an important part of New Zealand and Australia that the Pacific Island peoples are part of us and have been for decades. And so the emphasis and focus for Australia to the Pacific and New Zealand to the Pacific should be a natural thing, because they're our whānau, they're our family. And from a Māori perspective, we are Polynesians. We've come from the Pacific, and we're just very southern Polynesians, and in terms of being Māori. So there is an unspoken connection, a relationship which is very tangible, so that when we see our Pacific Island brothers and sisters, they're part of who we are. And so you would think that Australia and New Zealand have to consider them, not from a token perspective, but from a perspective that they're part of our communities, and that they've been part of our communities for many, many decades. And so my question goes on to the future. What do you see the future is for the Pacific? Having the attention of China from a development perspective surely is good to a certain extent, and them jostling for influence with the US is that surely it brings in attention, it brings in capital, it brings in support for infrastructure, it helps to address climate change. So where do you see that sweet spot is? I mean, do you think China and the US and Australia and New Zealand should be working with each other? Or is that competition for influence creating a really good result where the Pacific Islands are able to sort of maximize that attention? So my question to you, my friend, is that where is that sweet spot? Where is that future? How do you see the Chinese, the Americans, Australia, New Zealand, anyone in the Pacific, even the French, how do you see their influence impacting us going forward? And when I say us, I'm talking about we're the Pacific. New Zealand's the Pacific now. We've been for a long time, so is Australia. So this competition which is going on, how does it impact the future?
Yeah. Well, I think we're looking at a crystal ball here. We can talk about what the future could be like with this competition continuing. Really, the end game is how the superpowers handle it. I mean, China will continue with its expansion. We know that everything is driven from Beijing, and and they've got definite policies that they want to spread across the world. So it's an ideological. I think it's an ideological thing that underpins all this competition. We've got the West, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. We're talking about democracy. We're talking about freedom of people to choose. And then we've got China, as you know, it's different. They've got a different ideological outlook altogether. And so that difference will determine the future. All the things that they're doing now are probably laying the groundwork for what is going to happen later. I think the economic aspect comes first. And then the other aspects will come later, whether it's security or otherwise. Now, as far as the region is concerned, I think it's a good start that they have made in allowing Australia and New Zealand to be part of the forum as members of the various sub-regions. That they can now have a say too, because they are members. They can now participate in the leaders meeting. So they are part of the whole process. So anything that happens in the Pacific affects Australia and New Zealand. They're not just standing from a distance and then deciding from the distance. No, now they are in the circle now. And so whatever happens in the Pacific affects them as well. Whereas before, there was an understanding, right? But there was that gap. Australia and New Zealand are there, we are here. We talk about the Pacific as a region, that we are as a family, which is the new slogan now. At that time, they were just words, eh? But now they're actually doing it. It's now they've taken action and they said, look, we won't just talk about it, now we're going to do it. And I think that's a very positive move from not only the perspective of the region, but from Australia, New Zealand, and the US as well. Eh? And I think China is mindful about this. And I'm sure they must have been hurt when they were not invited and given the same privilege as it was given to the US Vice President to address the meeting. And I think it's a big blow, really, to China. And I really take my hat off the Prime Minister of Fiji, Bainimarama, for inviting the Vice President. It's got to take a bit of courage to do that, especially when China has been very good to Fiji, right? When Australia, New Zealand, and the US deserted Fiji during the political upheavals of 1987 and 2020 and 2000 and 2006, all these Western countries, they deserted Fiji. They broke ties, right? They suspended their diplomatic ties because of the coups. China, however, carried on and stood beside Fiji. And so, in that respect, I think Fiji and others, I think in the Pacific, will not forget that. China's contribution during their hard times.
Yeah.
Even after the coup in 1987, when that happened, and a lot of skilled people left Fiji and went overseas. It was Rumbuka himself. He came up with the look north policy. He said, if we ever go, we'll bring the Chinese here, to fill in the gaps. And so that's the, that was the perception at that time, that China is always there to help it. And I think it's still here. But I think the decision by Mr. Bainimarama to invite Kamala Harris to address the PIF leaders meeting, I think it was quite, what shall I say, it was quite a momentous occasion, for the region. And so I don't know, from here onwards, I don't know how China hasn't reacted yet. I haven't seen anything that shows that China is not happy, or how did it react to that decision to be shut out from the leaders' meeting.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be a wonderful day if they could all work together? If China could continue to develop economically with the US and Australia, maintaining the security relationships, and also those relationships which have extended for decades and decades. And I think the other key thing too is that, surely number one focus in the Pacific Islands is climate change, in terms of what's happening, to the foreshores, what's happening to islands which are being swept over by the rising oceans. And so whether it's China, the US, Australia, New Zealand, anyone, everyone has a responsibility to address that. And so I think what you said was really interesting, is that, it's a crystal ball right now, but that crystal ball seems to look pretty favorable for the Pacific if they stay together. And that's probably my last sort of question to you, is that, with Kiribati and also the recent agreement with the Solomon Islands, the security agreement and development agreement with China, is that while we've got this focus of Australia and New Zealand becoming part of the PIF as voting members, we've also got this dissension that we talked about earlier on, where Kiribati left the PIF and the Solomons have now signed the security and development agreement with China. Is that, and this is not a dampening question, but it's a concerning question. Is, Nemani, we've always assumed that Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia have always worked together as a pack. They've always been together, and they've worked together for so many years in different areas. And but now we see some chinks, we see some in the armor, we see some cracks, we see some some parting of the ways potentially. Is there a danger that if the Pacific, the PIF, maintain one particular group, one particular emphasis, and while they ignore the other, could we see more sort of these types of situations? Could we see the Cook Islands? Could we see Tonga? Could we see any of the islands begin to sort of part ways from the PIF because they're not together? So my question to you right now is that, are we potentially going into also in that crystal ball sort of outlook? Is there a rough period coming up potentially? Do we see the PIF breaking up because of this jostling? Is that a potential?
Well, our Prime Minister here, she's pretty confident that Kiribati is going to be back in the fold, right?
Yeah.
And I think Bainimarama is also confident that Kiribati is going to be back. I think they will be back. China has denied that it had anything to do with Kiribati's decision to withdraw. That was this sovereign decision as an independent nation, and China had nothing to do with it. And so that's from China. whether you believe it or not, that's from China. So I think moving forward, I think as long as the PIF remains united and works with all, not only Australia, New Zealand, and the US, but also works with China, I think the future looks good. It looks bright from a development perspective. Already we're seeing the fruits or the benefits of this jostling going on between China and the US, and the US partners in the region. We're seeing the economic benefits. Things are coming back. The American Peace Corps volunteer is back. All these other development agencies are back. But why weren't they there in the first place? Why did they take them out? That's a question. And so they are back now. They are back because, like I said earlier, because of China's growing influence. And they are back now. They want to reassert themselves and say, look, this is our turf, right? And we're going to make sure that we regain it. And we're going to put an embassy in Kiribati and one in Tonga. And who knows, maybe one in Vanuatu next. And one in the well, I think the Solomons, they've got one there. And so all these islands that haven't got embassies, they'll put them, whether it's economical or not, that's beside the point. The point is they have a presence in the region. And I think that's the profile that they want to show, that look, we are back and we mean business. And so and China, of course, will take note. And I tell you what, China will up the ante. They will up the ante. So from that perspective, I think it's good for the region, because now the region gets more attention. They will get more development aid. They will get more support, right? Because the superpowers want their attention and wants their support. And so I think it's good. I think it's good. I mean, I'm being positive here, and because I'm just looking at how things are going. This thing, it's a bit of a worry what's happening in between China and Taiwan. We can't totally separate what's happening there. The tension that is building up in that part of the region. Yeah. But because what happens there is going to affect the Pacific as well. But if you see what's happening, any talk between China and Taiwan, Australia is included. Yeah, and if Australia is included, then New Zealand is included. And if Australia and New Zealand are included, the rest of the Pacific is included. You know what I mean? Yeah. If something breaks out in the face-off between China and Taiwan, it's going to spill over. It will spill over. That's, we're looking at the crystal ball here. But economically, I think it's good for the Pacific. I think we are now positioned to be able to really develop the Pacific. The Pacific needs a lot of development aid. Climate change is a big thing now. Climate change, and climate finance is huge. A lot of coastal villages and settlements. I'm talking about Fiji now, and of course it applies to the rest of the region, are under threat of being submerged by a rising sea level. And so either they build sea walls, which is quite an expensive exercise, or they relocate, which again costs a lot of money. And these are the things we're looking at.
Sorry, my friend, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's the end, is it?
No, well, look, Vanaka Vakulivu.
Yeah.
This is amazing. I think talking to you today has also brought back a focus, I guess, for me as a New Zealander, someone that's strongly Pacifica influenced. You know, Pacifica is part of who I am as a person. I mean, I even have my Buller shirt on today. You know,
I see that. Yeah,
yes, yes,
I should have worn my bullet shirt,
and,
but I'm too cold.
I'm thinking
I'm,
you've got a top that's been made in China, and you're wearing it today, but which is not a bad thing. But I guess the thing that sort of helps me to sort of focus and think about the things that we've talked about today is that the Pacific Islands are really important. They're important to New Zealand, Australia, to the US, to China, as a security sort of zone, as an area of the world. But it's importantly to understand, and I think this is the thing that I want to keep re-emphasizing, is that Pacifica peoples, you know, have for many years been exposed, they've been colonized, they've been, you know, put into situations where foreign entities have sort of made themselves known, have influenced the dynamics of each of those countries and nations in terms of their own sovereignty. And but everyone, and I could say this probably for the world, is that we've always looked at the Pacific Islands as being warm, loving, friendly, welcoming, and it's a part of the world which you know people go to sort of like vacation and relax and enjoy the people, the climate, and the country, and the food and so on, the fish, all the kaimoana. So for me, I and looking at this whole dynamic and play, it's interesting now that we've got so much attention from the superpowers in these areas, and they've always been there, but it's becoming more prevalent. And you talk about the challenge between Taiwan and China. Well, we've seen what's happened to Ukraine and Russia, and we've seen how that's mapping out right now, and how that's an absolute tragedy. And then, you know, finally, you know, what if we have a situation that Taiwan and China move to that type of conflict? And, you know, how do we all get drawn in, and what's the impact of that upon all of us? So I think the things that we've talked about today are really crucial. They're really important from a security perspective, because we can connect everything up. And as you've referred to in this last hour or so, that the Taiwan Chinese situation is something that we need to be aware of. And that, you know, us perhaps trying to ignore it or not doing anything about what we're seeing in that part of the world could be a real challenge for us in the future. And I'm talking about what's happened to the Ukraine and Russia, and, you know, the stance of Europe and the rest of the world around that whole conflict. So, Nemani, I just wanted to say again, you know, Vanaka Bakalivu, this has been a wonderful way to spend my morning talking to you. And
thank you.
no doubt we're going to catch up soon. But
Yeah.
I want to give the last word to you, and maybe get some sage advice from you, or some counsel, or how you see the world going for the Pacific Islands. Obviously, I hope at the next Rugby World Cup next year, I hope that every Pacific nation does well. I hope
So, but it it doesn't look good after the weekend.
Well, even the Americans, the US lost to Chile, you know, and
I know.
so.
I know.
But this is another podcast that we'll talk about the Rugby World Cup. But wouldn't it be wonderful if the 8 quarterfinalists were Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific nations? Wouldn't that be incredible? But maybe that will happen in the future. But look, my friend, that the last word goes to you, and I just wanted to say mihi to you before you talk last, and to say thank you so much for participating and taking time to talk to us. But now I want to pass it through to you, Korero, Matua, and let you take this final moments. Kia ora.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth, for giving me the opportunity to be able to share some of my insights into what's happening in the Pacific, in as far as China and the US, Australia, and New Zealand are concerned, and of course the rest of the region. I think the future looks good. From what transpired at the recent Pacific Island Forum meeting in Suva, I think the future looks bright. Even though Kiribati has sort of moved out, and I think it's temporary, and I think they will come back. They will come back because they cannot afford to be out there alone. They need the support of the Pacific Island Forum to be able to function effectively. Kiribati is one of the islands in the region that is under threat from rising sea level. It's a sinking paradise, Kiribati. He needs all the help he can get to be able to deal with this challenge. And that's something that the Pacific Island Forum had addressed in this meeting in Suva. They're looking at the Blue Pacific strategy up to 2050, and what needs to be done to try and not only mitigate but to adapt to the changing the changing dynamics in the region as far as climate change is concerned. And that's one of the big challenges that the region now faces. How it deals with the climate change. Now, Australia had sort of let us down in the past. Had talked about climate change, but never really supported the efforts of the region. Now with the new leadership there, they're going to change it, and so they're going to move with the Pacific. Now New Zealand is good because New Zealand is stuck with the Pacific on its position about climate change. But now with Australia changing, we are looking forward to a better future on how to deal with climate change. And of course, the other big thing is the security, as we talked about. And in the middle is the development. I think the Pacific needs all that assistance that it needs to be able to develop and to be able to keep up with the changes that are happening around the world. And so, I'm pretty positive of the future, that things are going to get better.
Yeah.
But at the back of my mind, that thing about security is still hanging there, because there's always this talk about setting out of military or naval base in the Pacific by the superpowers. The Americans that were thinking of setting up one in Sabu Sabu, in Fiji, during the Cold War, but it never happened. But what would stop their military, their naval ships of coming around the region? They can be out there in the open sea and nobody would know or would see them. They'd be out lurking in the background. So, I mean, the technology, the world has become smaller because of technological development, and so, yeah. Overall, Gareth, I think the Pacific is in a much better position now to be able to deal with the challenges in the future. Now with Australia, New Zealand as part of the family, not just virtually, but physically and being part of and also with the US committed to coming in and really show that it means business. And on the other side, China is going to come back, and it's going to come back with a lot of help to try and counter the increase in the level of assistance from the other three countries. So in that respect, I think it's good for the Pacific, because now they will get the attention they need to be able to develop the region. Thank you.
Banaka Waku Levu, kia ora mātua, thank you so much for your contributions today.
Thank you.
And we'll see each other soon. So, mode, my friend, and
Morning.
have a great day today. Kia ora.
Thank you. You too.
Kia ora whānau. Just one thing I wanted to add at the very end is that it appears to me, as I've gone through the interview with Nemani and I've considered everything that we've talked about, that maybe there's an opportunity here where, with these superpowers which are beginning to exert influence in the Pacific, is that there is an opportunity for development and security at the same time. And perhaps this competition is creating a focus and an emphasis and an influence in the Pacific. And importantly, for us to start thinking about climate change and how it's impacting the whole area. So from a positive perspective, is that maybe what's happening with China and the US jostling with each other to have greater influence in the Pacific, is that more attention is being brought to what's really important, and that's reversing or impacting positively the negative consequences of climate change. And so one can potentially sit back and think that maybe this is not such a bad thing. Certainly with Australia and New Zealand and the superpowers which are out there, which continue to look at the Pacific in terms of its security interests, its development sort of strategies, and its partnership plans, there could be some really good outcomes and results for the Pacific. So it was just a note, something to consider. And the challenge, though, is for the Pacific to remain Pacific and for the people to be self-determined and to ensure that they are who they are and remain the beautiful, warm, loving people of this earth, which is the Pacific Islands. So with that, kia ora whānau. Thank you for listening to this podcast once again. And we'll reconnect up in a few more podcasts in the future. Kia ora.